Hi. So today I'm going to talk about rabbinic literature. Let's go back a step. You have there are four periods of Jewish history. Simply put, they are the biblical period, and the rabbinic period, and the medieval period, and the modern period. The rabbinic period is roughly, I don't know, from the turn of the millennia, that is from like the year 1 CE to 500 CE, something like that. These are big generalizations. And the word rabbinic has the word rabbi in it, which means that the rabbis became the principal architects of Judaism during this time. Not during the first part of it, the first 70 years of this millennium, but after that. After you no longer had priests, you no longer had a temple. So one of the key junctures of Jewish history is the year 70 CE, when you no longer had a temple and Judaism had to go on without its central institution in Jerusalem, the temple in Jerusalem. And so last time I talked about that there were four main sects in Second Temple Judaism in the beginning of this period. And they were the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the Essenes and the Apocalyptices. And so the rabbis took over they sort of took control over Judaism, but let me explain what that means. It doesn't mean that they were ruling anybody. The Roman Empire was over Judea, and the Jewish people did not have an army, did not have a state. As a matter of fact, they wouldn't have a state from the year 66 or so BCE to 1948, when the state of Israel was created in a great miracle in modern times. So that's about 2,000 years. But here are the Jewish people, and they're trying to figure out their lives. They're trying to figure out their religion, trying to figure out what happened. If for the modern Jewish people, the Holocaust was the main event and the creation of the state of Israel, the destruction of the Second Temple was huge. So the rabbis are trying to figure it out, and they come up with a system of study and verbal prayer. That is, instead of animal sacrifice, you had verbal prayer. You always had some verbal prayer, but now it became the central mode of worship. And they created a document called the Mishnah. And the Mishnah is, I'm going to show you the table of contents for the Mishnah, if I can do this. And I guess I don't know what to do. Let's see. Yes, I did it. Okay. So here is the Mishnah. Let me explain what the Mishnah is. The Mishnah is the oral law. That is, the rabbi said that the oral law had been passed down to them from Mount Sinai, from Moses, over the course of about 1,300 years or so. And now it's going to be written down. So I just want you to look at this table of contents and to see what was in the Mishnah. What was in the Mishnah was, you see, it starts out with agriculture. And let me give you an example here of payah gleanings. We talked about this once. There'd be the farmer, the Jewish farmer, would have a field, and it would be time for the harvest, and he would save the corners of the field. Payah means the corners of the field, so that the poor people could come. And we talked about why the corners, so that they wouldn't have to run into the middle of the field. They could just take the food from the corners and run off and not be humiliated. I've compared it to something we have in Hamden, Connecticut, called the Hamden Food Bank, where you can come in a door, take some bread if your family is hungry, and you don't have to go through any buzzers or anything like that. You don't need any permission. You can just take it, and so you're not humbled by needing that charity. So this is an example of the kind of thing that's in the Mishnah, but it gets very complicated in a sort of a delightful way, and I'm charmed by this. Well, what if it's not a wheat field? What if it's an orchard? What constitutes a corner when you're talking about trees? How big a corner are we talking about? And so down into the details, into every possible situation, they're working out what is a corner, how, what does it mean to be poor, all of these different things. And what they're creating in the process is an ideal society. Let's go back to something very basic about Judaism, the belief in the Messiah. As this belief developed over the centuries, there was the concept that every person should have their own vine and their own fig tree, and no one should make them afraid. The Mishnah is embodying laws about creating that ideal society. But look here again at, these are all details about giving tithes, giving charity. Here, Moed is about the different holidays. How do you observe the different holidays? Nashim, this was a patriarchal society, and I never enjoy talking about this part, but the tractate, the division of Nashim, is about how you get married, what happens if there's adultery, how you get betrothed, how you get divorced. And it's really about women in transition. That is, from one state of one part of their lives to another, when they're getting betrothed, when they're getting married, if they're getting divorced, if their husband dies and they don't have a means of support, what happens to them? So again, this is assuming, the grand assumption of the Mishnah is that all of the laws of the land are these laws. But remember something. Remember that the Romans were in control. The Romans were in complete control of this country, the country of Judea. The Jewish people were not even citizens. They lived there. They paid taxes, but you would never know it from the Mishnah. The Mishnah is creating a utopian society, and it's ahistorical. Ahistorical means it has nothing to do with what was going on historically at that time. There isn't a line or a law or anything like that in the Mishnah to reflect what was going on in real life. This is an ideal society. And I come back now to that messianic vision. Every person shall have their own vine and their own fig tree, and none shall make them afraid. The Mishnah is trying to articulate this, but not in terms of poetry, in terms of laws. In a certain way, laws are a kind of Jewish poetry. Because in Judaism, there are concepts. There's a concept of love and there's a concept of justice. And we don't really count on people loving their neighbors. It would be great if they could. It would be great if you have a neighbor that you could love and that loves you. But that often doesn't happen, does it? But what can happen is you can do justice by your neighbor. I have an expression that I made up that I use all the time: love shmuv, do the right thing. Whether you love your neighbor or you don't love your neighbor, you have to do right by your neighbor. You have to do justice. Well, the Mishnah tells you how to do that. And it tells you how to have a society, and it tells you how to worship. And it tells you down here, say in Nezikin, okay, well, what if you have an ox and your ox gores somebody else's ox? Who pays? How does it work? When are you considered negligent? And some of these things go back to Mishpatim, to the book of Exodus, the chapters 21 through 23, but they're working them out. And also they're updating them. And this is very important. The conditions of society in the time of the Mishnah, in the common era, say, 100 to 500, were not the same as they were back in the time of the Bible. And so these laws, which are claiming to be the oral laws, sent down, transmitted over the centuries from Moses to now, are actually laws that the rabbis are creating, and we're going to see an example of them creating it. And one rabbi says this, and one rabbi says that, and that's very important. I'll get to that in 1 second. You have this tractate here. The fifth division is called Kodashim, about sacrifices. What's weird about this is no sacrifices could be made anymore. I explained that a couple of minutes ago. We're living in a time, the Mishnah was produced around the year 200 CE. For 130 years at this point, there had been no sacrifices, not one sacrifice at all. And yet here, this whole section is about how to do sacrifices. Think about what I'm saying, because it's jarring. There's a whole tractate about how to do sacrifices, how to do these rituals at a time when for 130 years there had been none. Why? It's utopian. It's saying someday we're going to have a temple again. And when we have a temple again, here's how it will happen. But it ignores the fact that the temple isn't in existence. You would think that the temple exists and that they're doing sacrifices every day, and here are the laws by which you do sacrifice. It's, again, ahistorical. It has nothing to do with reality. It is the ideal. So this gives you, some examples of what's in the Mishnah. Now, I go on to talk to show you something, the very beginning of the Mishnah. And I hope that you can see this. Okay. This is how the Mishnah starts. Now, when I say this is how the Mishnah starts, I mean this is how I'm sorry if I'm making you dizzy. This will just have to do. Yeah, that's good. It moved without me. The Mishnah, forget about the names. Those are just the translators. This is Brachot. It's the very first Mishnah of the Mishnah. That is, the Mishnah is the whole book, and in each one of the laws is a Mishnah. Now, here's what it says. From what time may they recite the Shema in the evening? And now, if you're looking at this, and you don't know anything about the Mishnah, and you don't know much about Judaism, you have no idea what it's talking about. What's the Shema? Why do they have to recite it? What's in there? Now, I'll explain. The Shema is one of the most important Jewish prayers. It says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad." And then it goes on to talk about how you should love God, and you should be loyal to God, and you should teach your children about God and the commandments. And you should, when you're walking by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. And so one of the sentences in there is, when you lie down, you should say the Shema. Now, you have to know everything I just said in order to read that first sentence. From what time may they recite the Shema in the evening? That is, okay, if you're supposed to say the Shema in the evening, from what time is it okay to do that? And up till what time is it okay to do that? So here's what it says. From the hour that the priests enter their homes, notice, the priests enter their homes to eat their heave offering. But this is at a time there are no priests eating their heave offerings. There are no heave offerings. And so they're saying, okay, from what time can you do this? And they're answering it with something that doesn't exist. And then they say, from what time till what time? Until the end of the first watch, the words of Rabbi Eliezer. But the sages, that is, most of the rabbis said until midnight. And Rabbi Gamliel says until the rise of dawn. Now, let's go over this. There's a prayer, and you're supposed to know what this prayer is. The fact that there's an assumption, the fact that there's the assumption that you know what they're talking about, shows who the Mishnah is for. It's not for a non-Jewish person who doesn't know what the Shema is. It's not for a Jewish person who doesn't know much about Judaism, who doesn't know what the Shema is. There's the assumption that, again, in this idealistic, ideal, utopian way, that everybody who's reading this knows what the Shema is, and they're down to the particulars, to the details of from what time can you say it up till what time. Now notice something else, just about this same little passage. There's a Rabbi Eliezer, and he says until the end of the first watch. What does that mean? You can say the Shema, but your deadline, you can only say it up till the end of the first watch. Well, you have to know what the first watch is. Let's say it's 10 o'clock. Remember that there are watchmen going around the city. But again, that's telling you something about their society, that there are watchmen going around the city at night, protecting the community. Okay, so they're talking about their time and place. When you have watchmen, maybe we should have watchmen today, and we don't. But they have that's the end of the first watch, and then there'll be a second watch. So that's what Rabbi Eliezer says. If this passage had come down, if these laws came down from Moses on Mount Sinai, had been transmitted over 2,000 years, you wouldn't need opinions. They would already know this. This is supposedly the oral law, but it actually seems to be the laws created by the rabbis of this time in the 2nd century CE. So Rabbi Eliezer says until the end of the first watch, but the sages say, no, you can say it until midnight. Let's say you get home late, and you get home after the end of the first watch, right? You can still say it till midnight. And then Rabban Gamliel says until the rise of dawn. And it's like, what constitutes night? If you have to say the Shema in night, how do we define night? So notice that there are 3 opinions about this question: up till when can you say the Shema at night? Assuming that you know what the Shema is, assuming that you want to say the Shema, assuming that you're a religious person who says the Shema every evening, otherwise it wouldn't be an issue for you. Notice again, this is how the Mishnah starts, and there's no introduction. It doesn't say this was the oral law passed down from Mount Sinai. You're supposed to know that. It doesn't give you any information. It doesn't give you any context. It doesn't give you any background, because the context and the background are assumed by these rabbis who are giving it and by the editors of the Mishnah. And again, it doesn't say when this was written. It doesn't say who wrote it. It doesn't tell you anything. It just assumes all these things. So you understand something about audience. Let me try to give a weird example through a joke. There are people at an astronomers convention. And so somebody says, did you hear about the restaurant on the moon? Great food, but no atmosphere. And everybody cracks up. Now, I don't know if you're laughing, but in order to laugh, in order to understand the joke, you'd have to understand that there's no atmosphere on the moon. Okay, atmosphere is a pun on, does the restaurant have ambiance? Does it have, is it, nicely lit or romantically lit or something like that? So, but all the astronomers would get it immediately because they are a community of people who know about the moon. And you don't have to give them background information to do that. Again, there's a community here that's reading this book, that cares enough to read this book, and doesn't care about the Romans, and doesn't care about history, doesn't care about anything, just cares about what they're going to do. There have been points in Judaism, this was one of them, when the Jewish people turn inwards. And when we get to the modern movements of Judaism, we'll be talking about this again. That sometimes the Jewish people move out towards the world, but sometimes, especially in dark times or after dark times, the Jewish people turn inwards, and all they care about is doing their thing, doing their rituals. But there's something else here, which is the idea is that if we can do our stuff, if we can do our laws, then the Romans don't matter. And history, in a sense, doesn't matter. And we will change history. And one of the weirdest parts is that they continued Judaism by turning inwards, by doing their laws, by just being good people, by doing charity, by leaving the gleanings for the poor, by doing their rituals in the morning and the evening. And they carried on Judaism through what was a really dark period when they were being oppressed in terrible ways. For quite a while, the Romans didn't even let Jewish people go into Jerusalem. And how did the Jewish people answer? By talking about sacrifices that were being made in Jerusalem that weren't being made in Jerusalem because they couldn't even go there. This tells you a little bit about the rabbis and how they did their work. Now think about this as the context for the beginning of Christianity, the context in which Jesus was born and lived and died. And that's what we'll get to in the next session. Thank you.